When I was 18, I was in my last year of high school. It was 2008, and even though I had a cell phone, I wasn't on social media yet. I had a good group of friends by that time, and we would get together for a party at least once a month. One weekend, we decided to meet up at my friend Jerome's place. His parents were out of town, which meant we had the place to ourselves for the night. Jerome's house had a big basement, perfect for parties. Me and a few others headed over right after dinner. I lived close by, and it was only a 15-minute walk for me, so I was the first one there. After a couple hours, about 20 people showed up. Most of them were from our school, and were all people I knew pretty well. We all hung out in the basement, some sitting on the couches, but most of us were standing around talking. It was just a typical high school party. I spent the first part of the night talking to a few friends, making the usual rounds. Eventually I grabbed a drink and ended up standing next to someone I didn't recognize. I figured he was just another friend of a friend, so I started talking to him. He told me his name was Ethan, and that he had just moved to our school. I thought it was a little strange that I hadn't seen him around before, but since it was a big school, it wasn't impossible. We were getting along well, and he was pretty funny. After a while, I gave him my number. He sent me a quick text to make sure I got it, and we kept talking. At some point, I noticed Jerome coming back down to the basement from upstairs. I excused myself and went to talk to him for a bit. When I looked back a minute later, Ethan had disappeared. Jerome asked me who I'd been talking to, and I told him it was some new guy named Ethan. Jerome just shrugged and said he didn't know him. That seemed odd, because Jerome knew practically everyone. The rest of the party went on without incident, and I didn't see Ethan again. At around 1 in the morning, I decided to leave the party and head home. I stayed pretty much sober that night, so I was still feeling pretty good. It wasn't a long walk, maybe 15 minutes, so I felt alright walking alone. As I started walking, my phone rang. I pulled it out and checked the caller ID. It was Ethan. I was a bit surprised since he had disappeared hours earlier, but I picked it up anyway. He sounded pretty casual and asked if I wanted to go to another party. I told him no, explaining that I was already on my way home and wasn't really in the mood for another late night. He tried to keep the conversation going, but I just thanked him and hung up. I kept walking, but a minute later, a car pulled up slowly beside me. I glanced over and saw Ethan sitting in the passenger seat. A woman I didn't recognize was driving, and she looked like she was in her mid-40s. There was also someone else in the back seat, but I couldn't see much of them from where I was standing. Ethan leaned out the window and asked if I wanted a ride. I hesitated for a moment before telling him no. I said that I was fine walking. He seemed a bit pushy though, insisting that it wasn't a big deal and that I should just hop in. I gave a polite excuse, saying I needed to get home, but he kept at it. He was trying way too hard to convince me. They drove along slowly next to me as I kept walking, and I started to feel a little weird about the whole thing. But there were a few cars behind them waiting to pass, so I wasn't all alone completely. I just focused on getting home and kept my pace steady, hoping they'd give up soon. The longer they followed me, the more I started running out of excuses to politely turn them down. Ethan was still trying to convince me to get in the car, and the whole situation felt off. The woman driving stayed quiet, which made it even more uncomfortable. She just stared straight ahead while Ethan talked. I was glad there were other cars behind them, because if we had been alone on the road, I would have been more concerned. I tried to wave them off one more time, telling them I was almost home anyway, but they kept following. Of course, I wasn't actually going to lead them to my house. I was actually going to circle around the block if it came to that. But before I could, the car came to a complete stop, and the passenger door swung open. Ethan motioned for me to get in, and I instinctively stepped back. I didn't know what they were planning, but I wasn't about to find out. I took a few more steps away from the car, ready to run if I had to. Just as I was bracing myself, one of the cars behind them started honking. For a moment, Ethan hesitated. He glanced at the driver, and after a few seconds, he pulled the door shut. They sped off down the road without saying another word. I stood there for a minute, watching them disappear. I kept walking until I made it home. For the rest of that night, my phone was blowing up with calls, but I didn't answer. The next morning, I had more than 20 missed calls. I blocked the number later that day and never heard from him again. To this day, I still don't know what that was all about, but I'm glad I didn't get into that car. I work as a bartender at a bar. Some days when I work, I have some really dark moments like the one I'm about to tell you about. One day, I was working and I got a phone call. Not knowing what to expect, I said the bar's name, then I said, "How can I help you?" The guy on the other line told me that his name was Bigby and that he was a sheriff. He told me that he was looking for a guy named Woody. I said that I didn't know a Woody. He then described him to me. He said that he is a big guy with a beard and he was last seen wearing a flannel shirt. I told him that I didn't see anyone that matches that description. This guy then asked me, "You really don't know where he is?" I said, "Nope." The guy then exclaimed at me, "This is serious. Harboring a fugitive is going to get you in as much trouble as he's in. You could lose everything." I asked, "You're trying to tell me how to do my job. What on earth makes you think that I am harboring this dude named Woody?" He wasn't making any sense. I still remained professional and then asked him, "Is there anything else I can help you with?" He then said in an impatient tone, "That's not important right now." I had enough of him and told him, "All right, have a good one," and I hung up the phone on my end. I hoped that would be the end of it. I thought this was over, but I then heard the phone ring again. We would get phone calls almost every minute, and anyone could be calling. I picked up the phone, and before I could even say anything, I heard a familiar voice say over the phone, "You can't just leave." Again, he was still telling me how I am supposed to do my job. What is his problem? I then said to him, "Actually, I can." He then groaned and said to me, "This is a murder investigation. If you don't give me what I want, I'm gonna tear your effing throat, arm, and face off." These words made me feel very intimidated. It hit me like a brick, and I knew this wasn't a sheriff speaking. Sheriffs don't ever speak like this to anyone on duty. I then thought about two possibilities. He's either lying about being a sheriff, or he actually is a sheriff, and just has a very screwed up brain with a lot of mental health issues. I then lost my patience and said, "Come down to the bar and have a chat with us, but don't call the bar again, or else I will call someone that I know who works at a phone center. He'll run your number, and we will have some problems." I then proceeded to slam the phone on the receiver, and that was that. I never got a phone call from him again, and he never ended up coming to the bar. As of now, I still want to know who that guy Bigby is, and what his deal was. I also wonder if he does this type of crap to other people who are working their jobs. I would hope not. This happened during the summer of 2012, when I was 16. School was out for the summer break, so I was home alone a lot because my parents worked long hours. My older brother Josh had moved out the year before, but he still lived in the same city, so we stayed in touch regularly. The house felt empty without him around, and I was getting used to spending most of my days by myself. It wasn't so bad though. I'd usually watch TV or play video games to pass the time, and since our neighborhood was quiet, I didn't worry much about anything. Most of my friends were away at the time when this happened, so I really was alone a lot. One day at around noon, I was sitting in the living room watching a show when the phone rang. I didn't think much of it and just picked up like usual. On the other end, a man's voice asked for my dad. Without thinking, I told him my dad wasn't home and that I was alone. The second those words left my lips, I regretted it. There was an awkward pause, and then out of nowhere, he hung up. I put the phone down and sat there for a minute. I was trying to convince myself that it was really just some sales guy looking for my dad. I went back to watching TV, hoping it was nothing, but it wasn't working. It was like I knew I had made a mistake, and the more I thought about it, the more I realized how dumb it was to tell a stranger that I was home by myself. About 10 minutes later, I glanced out the back window and my stomach dropped. There was a man standing in our backyard. He was just lingering there, not moving, and I had no idea who he was. My first instinct was to panic, but I forced myself to stay calm. I grabbed my phone and called my brother Josh. I didn't want to jump to conclusions and call the cops right away, so I thought it was best to call him first. I explained what was happening, and Josh said he'd be there in 15 minutes. It felt like forever. While I waited, I went around the house and double-checked that all the doors were locked. But as I was doing that, I heard a knock on the back door. I froze. The man from the backyard had walked up onto our back deck and was knocking on the glass. He hadn't seen me yet, and I didn't want him to. I stayed as far away from the door as I could. After a minute, the knocking stopped, but then I heard him fiddling with the lock. Before I could process what was happening, the door creaked open. I rushed to the front of the house and hid in the coat closet near the front door. I crouched down, trying to stay as quiet as possible. The man moved slowly through the house. I could hear him walking from room to room, but he hadn't found me. I stayed hidden, praying Josh would get there soon. After what felt like forever, I finally heard the front door swing open. I knew it had to be Josh. He walked right past me, but I still didn't make a sound, and he didn't open the closet. Before I knew it, my brother had made his way into the kitchen, where it sounded like the intruder was. Suddenly, I heard yelling. I couldn't tell exactly what was going on, but I knew they were fighting. I could hear grunts and things being knocked over. I didn't know who was winning, but I knew I had to see what was happening. I stepped out of the closet and ran into the kitchen. Josh had the guy pinned to the ground with his knee pressed into the man's back. The guy was struggling, but Josh had him under control. "Call the cops," Josh shouted. Then I scrambled to grab my phone again. My hands were shaking as I dialed, but I managed to tell the operator what was happening. It didn't take long for the police to arrive. They arrested the man and searched him. They didn't find anything on him, but when they were searching the house, they found a bag he had dropped by the back door. Inside it, there was a knife and a roll of duct tape. I felt a cold chill run through me when I realized what might have happened if Josh hadn't shown up when he did. We never found out exactly what the man's intentions were, but it seemed pretty clear he wasn't just there to rob the place. Looking back, I know how lucky I was that Josh got there in time. After that day, I never made the mistake of telling anyone I was home alone again. I used to work at a post office in 2016 before finding a much more suitable job. I eventually landed a position as a receptionist. Every phone call I'd take would be no issue, except for this one person. One afternoon after lunch, the phone started ringing. I picked it up and said my usual greeting. I then heard a man on the other line say, "Hi there, would you sign my petition?" Before I could say anything, he spoke again. This time he had a more aggressive tone of voice. He said over the phone, "Sign my petition, damn it." That took an unexpected turn. He continued to speak, and then he said, "Look, just sign the stupid petition." I then asked him what he was talking about. He then said the same line he just said before. That instant, I lost it. I yelled at him on the phone, "F you, mother effer." I still don't know why I cursed at him, because things then went in a whole other direction. After I cursed at him, he exclaimed at me, "Sign this petition, or I will follow you home and kill your dog." Then my anger was getting the best of me. I then sternly asked him what his name was. He said his name was Billy Joe Bob. I then asked him if he wanted to meet up, because I wasn't playing any games. I kept asking where he was, but he kept dodging the question as if he was too scared to meet up with me. Next thing you know, he was playing the victim card, and I remember him saying, "Here I was minding my own business, just enjoying my Second Amendment rights, and you people have to freak out on me." I was now in full rage mode. I then screamed at him over the phone. He then called me a communist, and I just laughed at his stupidity. He then asked me, "Can't we all just get along?" as if he didn't do anything wrong. I told him my whole home address so we could meet up, and I then asked him his, but he kept avoiding the question. He then said to me, "Shut up, moron, F you." I then threatened him and told him that I would bring a .40 caliber bullet and use it on him. He then acted scared and said, "Gee, I hope nobody is taping this." I then told him, "Yeah, because you threatened to kill my dog, and I'm just responding to your threat. I guess I'll hang up now unless you want to meet up with me." Then he did something completely random. He said, "You thought you weren't going to die today. Well, surprise." I then heard a gunshot over the phone. I laughed and said, "I'm not dying today," and then I just hung up the phone. As of today, I still don't know who that guy was, or what he could have possibly wanted. Maybe he was just prank calling me, or maybe he had some real anger issues.